Hello, I'm Kelly Hyman, and welcome to Unresolved, the Diddy cases. Joining me now, Justin Shepard. He is the host of the Justin, the Nick of Crime on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and on Substack at JustinTheNickofCrime.substack.com. Justin, the media covering around this trial has been pretty wild, to say the least, as well as the public interest around the day-to-day following of the court proceedings. Why is everyone following this case so closely?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I can't answer for everybody, but I can answer part of my, for me personally. I think that when you look at people who are in my age group specifically, I think there's a few different aspects. Diddy is responsible for a lot of the music that we grew up with and that we listened to, a lot of hits. He himself might not be the best solo artist, but he knew how to find talent and he knows how to produce. And I think that because of that, a lot of us are looking at this part of our, young adulthood and are kind of just glued to the screens on it. But a little bit more over than that, this is somebody who has been seemingly untouchable for decades at this point. He came into the game, in the mid 90s, came up very, very quickly as a promoter, moved into the music industry. He was central to that East Coast, West Coast hip hop war that was fueled in the 90s and ultimately led to the deaths of two of the greatest rappers that ever lived, which was Tupac Shakur, arguably, I guess, Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G., Christopher Wallace. And he was central to that, helping to fuel that fire as well. And then moving on, he's just kind of been a player in that world ever since. This is a man who at one point was either a billionaire or very close to being a billionaire. Even now, with his wealth being lower, he's still worth $400 million. And he's just been able to get away with so much of this stuff for, 30 years at this point in time. And now it's kind of all coming full circle. And I think, a lot of people are just like, how did this happen? How did it go on? And is he going to be held accountable for what he's done all this time?
So do you think he's going to be held accountable for what he allegedly has done?
I don't know. I think that the prosecution has done a fairly good job, but he also has the fantasy dream team pick of lawyers, and they are very, very good and very expensive at that. I think the estimate is like over $10 million just for the trial phase of this that he is spending, not including everything up for discovery and research and whatnot. Um, and I think that they've done a pretty good job trying to discredit. The other thing that's interesting too is with the jury makeup being, 8 men, 4 women, a lot of this case centers around the abuse, which he's not on trial for domestic violence or domestic abuse. He's on trial for sex trafficking, RICO, which is an umbrella over a lot of things, as well as the prostitution charge. And I think that what men are going to have a problem seeing, a lot of older men specifically, and this is just, my opinion, is a lot of men don't recognize that there are patterns of abuse here and that, yes, they were coerced. Yes, they could be trafficked. Did they say they loved him? Did they say they would come back for more because they wanted to spend time with him? Yes, they did, but that's also very recognizable as a cyclical pattern, of abuse. And looking at Cassie specifically, and Jane's a different story, but for Cassie, he controlled every aspect of what she was going to be. So from his girlfriend, if she decided that she wanted to say no or go against him, he could have had her blacklisted from the music industry forever. So she kind of had to play nice and keep the status quo just so she could possibly have a future career. Because if not, she would have lost everything.
So you talk about that, about the 8 men and the 4 females in regards to the sex trafficking charge. How do you think that plays out in regards to the RICO charge and the transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution?
Well, let me start with the easy one. My opinion is the transportation across state lines for prostitution. That's easily, I mean, I don't think anybody's even arguing that at this point in time. He would hire escorts. And yes, technically, escorts are supposed to be people that you spend time with. It's not supposed to involve sex from the legal standpoint. But we know that that's what he was doing, that he was flying in escorts from these different websites. Cowboys and Angels was his favorite one, apparently. Flying these escorts in, whether it was to Miami, New York, Turks and Caicos, wherever, for the purpose of engaging in these freak offs. So I think that that one's pretty easy. Now, regarding the trafficking and things like that, I think that's where it gets a little bit harder. And then that kind of, goes hand in hand with Rico, right? Because what you're looking at is trafficking with Cassie. You're looking at trafficking with Jane, who, for people who don't know, is a pseudonym because she's remaining anonymous. But you're looking at trafficking for them, but then you're seeing text messages where they are setting up these freak offs. They're reaching out to these escorts. They're making the payments to these escorts. And so I think that for a lot of, again, going back to men in this situation, they're going to look at this as these are women who were involved. I've seen it in my comments from a lot of guys, like they were just gold diggers. They were out for what they, what they could get from him. It's very typical misogynistic rhetoric that's around it. Um, and basically, I think that that's where you're going to have the biggest, or prosecution's going to have their biggest struggle getting, a guilty conviction on that. I think that I'm not saying that they won't, but I'm saying that's going to be probably the biggest struggle.
But isn't also potentially in regards to women as well, that some women, not saying the women on the jury, because we don't know who they are, would look at someone as you point out, some of the men say as gold diggers, but also have that same perception of Cassie as former girlfriend, or Jane, who's doing a pseudonym, is Diddy's former girlfriend as well, and think potentially the same thing.
100%, internalized misogyny is a very real thing. And, it's definitely an issue with women. I think it's more so a problem with men in these cases. But the unfortunate fact is that I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but a very large amount of women experience some type of abuse in their lifetime from an intimate partner. So whether it's physical, sexual, verbal, and I think that women then therefore are more keen to be able to hone in on that and notice what that difference is compared to a lot of men. So what you're saying is 100% correct. We don't know the story and background on these women that are on the jury, but that could absolutely be part of the issue. And it's not that all men wouldn't be able to recognize it either. I'm not saying that as a blanket statement. I'm just kind of using it as a general rule.
And so sex trafficking is also one of the predicate acts potentially of the RICO charge. And a lot of people have some confusion with the prosecution dropping some of the predicate acts. Let's talk about that, and what are your thoughts on that? And can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for Rico, it's very hard to understand. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get into trying to give the full on in-depth explanation. But this trial's happening in New York, where that was the area where Rico was initially kind of created for. It was created to go after organized crime, the mafia, which is that's the five families. So I think that if there's anywhere that's going to understand Rico from a jury perspective, a law perspective, it's going to be that New York, New Jersey area. So I think that they have that on their side. As far as the things that were dropped, it's gotten very confusing since yesterday, because kind of what happened last minute yesterday was prosecution came out and it was said that charges were dropped. And that's technically true, but with a caveat. So what they ended up dropping were things that were under the RICO. So attempted arson in regard to the bombing of Kid Cudi's car. And I think that prosecution did a decent job kind of connecting, with circumstantial evidence that Diddy was responsible for that, but they didn't go that extra step to definitively link him to it. I think that there's still reasonable doubt there. I think that one thing that they could have really pushed into is there was a part where I cannot remember the agent that showed up after the police were called on that, but he said that they saw a black Escalade parked outside that basically sped off essentially as soon as they left. He had the foresight to go ahead and jot that tag number down, and that tag was registered to Bad Boy Entertainment. So that's obviously Sean Diddy Combs, plus you have Capricorn Clark's there. If they had pushed that a little bit further to do a definitive, hey, he was definitely responsible for that, he was definitely there, they maybe could have kept that. So they've dropped the attempted arson. They dropped kidnapping on Jane and Cassie because they felt that that would be a little bit harder possibly to prove based on the cycle of texts where they're involved and things like that. And then they also dropped the aiding and abetting of the sex trafficking. Now, what people are getting confused about is oh, well, they dropped RICO, then they dropped sex trafficking. No, they dropped aspects of the RICO, because remember, RICO's a giant umbrella where they put a lot of other charges under. So there's still plenty of charges for RICO. They just got rid of those. And
They
same with
got
sex trafficking.
Right, they got rid of the alleged arson, but arson is still there. They got rid of the alleged kidnapping, but kidnapping is still there. And they got rid of the aiding of and abetting of sex trafficking, but sex trafficking is still there as well. Based on everything that you've heard, what do you think? Do you think he's going to be found guilty, innocent? What are your thoughts on that?
So in this moment, with everything that we've seen and heard, and that's without looking at what's happening with closing arguments at this point in time, because I don't know what that's going to be. But uh, if I was going to put money on it, I would say it's going to be a hung jury.
On all the counts?
I don't know about all the counts. I think prostitution will probably, I can't remember the exact verbiage. You said it earlier, but interstate, transportation to engage in prostitution. I think that one's kind of a no-brainer. I think that that's definitely easily proven. But as far as RICO and trafficking, RICO kind of, yeah, and I think trafficking for sure.
Trafficking for both Jane and Cassie, or maybe for one and not the other?
I think both, because again, it goes back to those texts. Cassie was with him for regardless for a decade. And I think that a lot of people, again, if you don't understand the cycles of abuse, don't realize that it takes about 7 times to leave. And that's with a normal human being who's not very wealthy, very powerful, very well connected. Diddy is all of those things. So it takes an average of 7 times to leave, but she was with him for 10 years. And I think that that's going to be difficult for a lot of jurors to process her being trafficked when it looks like she's a willing participant. And I think Jane more so because she's sitting up on the stand and it's very, very clear that she is still very much in love with him. At this point, he's still paying for her lawyers, her rent. And I think that for jurors, they're going to look at that and say, and again, I'm not in the courtroom, so I can't speak definitively, but from my perspective, I think the jurors in the courtroom are going to look at that and say, well, look, she's still with him, so it must not be that bad.
You focused a lot on the alleged victim's testimony. Can we talk about each of them that
Mhm.
you've perceived and what kind of impact you think they might have on the jury and their verdict?
Well, I think that let's start with Cassie because Cassie's very central to all of this. Um, Regarding Cassie, I think her testimony has been very powerful. I think what she showed was very powerful. And I think that, because she finally did eventually get away and she was able to, number one, file that lawsuit against Diddy, which he settled within 24 hours, then put out an apology video after, um, the footage from the Intercontinental Hotel was released. I think that that's the prosecution's best bet for convictions when it comes to a lot of these different charges, whether it's RICO and trafficking as well. Again, I'm not saying that they're going to get convicted for it, but I think that that's a really good bet because I think a lot of people can look at this as okay, she finally got away, she finally broke free, and now she's building a life for herself. Um, After enduring years of abuse, constantly, there's plenty of receipts and text messages constantly with her saying, "I don't want to do this. I have to do this. I have to take drugs to numb myself to be able to do this. I'm someone's daughter. You're threatening to do this." There's a lot of things that are very powerful, and I don't know how you can sit through, listen to, and read that and not become a little emotional, no matter where you are. Um, Now, regarding Jane, I think it's similar. Jane's the issue that I think people are going to have with Jane, and at least this is what I'm getting from feedback from people when I've talked about it, is Jane's story mirrors Cassie's almost identically. And I recognize that as being a pattern, which is exactly what prosecution is trying to prove. A lot of people are saying, well, she did this after, she's saying all this after Cassie's lawsuit came out. So she's just mimicking Cassie's lawsuit. None of this necessarily happened. She's just after it. But what people need to remember regarding Jane is she doesn't have a civil lawsuit against Diddy. She doesn't want to file a civil lawsuit against Diddy. She was a nervous wreck to testify against him in court. She didn't want to do it. She had to be given immunity. And at this point, he's the one still paying for her bills. So going against him is actually more detrimental. But I think that a lot of people, I don't know how the jury isn't, looking at it, but a lot of people are saying, well, she's just trying to mimic Cassie's story to get something out of this. Whereas I don't really think that that's the case.
Why don't you think that's the case?
Because if she was trying to get something out of him, there'd be a civil lawsuit against him. There would be, she wouldn't be up on that stand still very much acting and saying that she's in love with him. Um, the immunity thing, the fact that she's a nervous wreck, that she didn't want to do it. Like, she doesn't want to commit perjury, but she doesn't want to be up there either talking about him. But I think the biggest thing is that if she was really trying to mimic Cassie for her own self gain, then it would behoove her to have a civil lawsuit as well that would be very quickly settled, probably as quickly as Cassie's, if he felt that way. And then she's not doing that because she'd rather have a relationship with him, even if he is paying her bills. That $10,000 a month, $120,000 a year is significantly lower than what she would get in a lawsuit.
Why do you think that's lower than what she would get in a lawsuit?
Well, you look at what Cassie got. She got $20 million. She disclosed that. So let's just say Jane got a fraction of it. Let's say she got $2 million. Let's say she got $1 million. That's pretty much 10 years of that rent, roughly 9 years, 8 years, something like that. So that would be more worthwhile to her if she was just after the money.
Do you think she's just after the money?
I don't. I don't think she wants to be there. I don't think she's there for self gain.
What do your viewers think? Do they agree with you, disagree with you?
It's split. It's split. It depends on which platform too. If you ask Facebook, the Facebook people, they think that she's like almost 90% of them think that she's after self gain, after money, after notoriety, which she's testifying as a pseudonym to keep her identity unknown. So I don't know how she's going after notoriety, just logically speaking. But from a TikTok and Instagram perspective, and even YouTube, I think a lot more people, probably 75% of them, see this as, she's just another victim, almost like a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing, that she's still in that phase where she can't get away. She doesn't see the toxicity, and her love for him overpowers anything negative that's going on in that relationship.
Now, another alleged victim is Mia, a former employee of Diddy. What are your thoughts about her?
So Mia is very interesting, I thought, because this is the one of the three victims who is not a romantic partner. She was an employee, and I think that really helps prosecution with those RICO charges as well, because that's where it becomes the blurring of lines between personal and business, because he's making her live in her house, doesn't let her have a door lock on her door, barges in whenever he wants, tries to prevent her from going to her grandmother's funeral. And then let's just talk about the big thing. He rapes her repeatedly, and
Allegedly.
allegedly rapes her repeatedly, according to what she said. Yes, I don't want to be sued either. So allegedly rapes her, and makes her take various drugs and substances, allegedly. And I think that becomes very interesting because, like I said, this is the first time you're not having somebody who is a romantic partner. This is somebody who works for him that is now enduring the same type of abuse that he has supposedly been giving to Cassie. Well, we don't have to say it supposedly because we've all seen the video that he's been giving to Cassie and allegedly to Jane as well. And I think that kind of shows, hey, he's not just doing this with his intimate partners, he's doing this with employees as well, specifically female ones.
What are your followers' thoughts about Mia? Do they believe her, don't believe her, like her, don't like her? What do they think?
I think that most people found her to be compelling. I think that most people looked at what she had to say very differently than what Cassie had to say. And, she came before Jane. And I think that if you were to ask them, they'd probably, look at Cassie and Jane in a very similar light, similar but different at the end. Because again, Jane's still in it. But with Mia being an employee, I think that the biggest challenge that people have with her, or that I heard feedback wise, was why did she stay employed with him? She had worked with some pretty big people before. She worked with pretty big people after. Why did she stay employed with him? And I don't really have an answer for that, other than, possibly fear or worried about being blacklisted. That's been a fear of a lot of these people, is that not only would they lose, their physical selves, or, who they were as people, but from their career perspective, they could be back to square one in their careers. And for a lot of people, that was the most important aspect, and they couldn't see past that. And I think that Mia was part of that. Now, ultimately, we know that she landed on her feet from all of that, which is good, but I think that it was pretty fearful. It would be a fearful person to work for. And then let me circle back a little bit to the very beginning, when he found out that she had worked for Suge Knight at one point. And for people who don't know, Suge Knight, I would say, is Diddy's biggest rival. They've been rivals when it came to the East Coast, West Coast wars and you had Bad Boy Records and Death Row Records, Bad Boy was Diddy or Puff Daddy back then, Sean Combs, and Suge Knight was the other one. And, both people had their top artists die as a result of this. And Diddy was very unhappy with that, obviously. And so I think that also added a layer of fear for her.
Talk about Capricorn Clark. She alleges that she was kidnapped by Diddy. Believable, not believable? What do you think, and what do your followers think?
I think that nobody is discounting that. I think we all believe that she was, not kidnapped in the sense, at least in the Kid Cudi instance, where she was held, and said, "Hey, you're coming along with us. You're doing this." I think first, let's start there, and then I want to get to the lie detector part. But she was forced to come along. She didn't want to do it, and she even called and warned them, which was very brave of her, in my opinion. And I think that shows, number one, she didn't want to be there, but two, she recognizes that what's going on in this situation with him allegedly, throwing a Molotov cocktail, cutting the top of his Porsche, and then throwing a Molotov cocktail in, and then breaking into his house, locking his dog in the bathroom. I think that Capricorn's like, this is not right. Let me call them, and then they ultimately called the police, which is a very risky move on her part to do with Diddy there, because who knows what the fallout would have been. So I think that nobody's arguing, the kidnapping there. They're just not seeing it as a, hey, they took her for several days and kept her in a locker room, like what you think of when you think kidnapping. Now, the jewelry thing is very interesting because I think that is more traditional style kidnapping. For those of you guys who might not remember the story, basically, there was jewelry as his assistant. A lot of times celebrities will be given jewelry to borrow that they don't own to wear at certain events because it's good for the jewelers that do it. So Diddy was given, I forget, it was like what, $100,000 worth of jewelry or maybe more. And her job was to transport it, and the bag of jewelry got lost. And we don't know what happened to it, but Diddy was convinced that Capricorn Clark was the one that was responsible for this, and subjected her, basically had her taken to a warehouse and subjected for, I think it was 4 or 5 days of lie detector test and interrogation, and told that if Diddy found out that she was lying, that she'd be thrown in the East River. I mean, there's no other way to interpret that, right? Like that's threats of violence, that's threats of harm, that's being, kept and threatened with your life, allegedly. And I think that, how else do you interpret that?
That's a good point. Yeah, swimming with the alleged fishes, so to speak. You talk about a lot of the different alleged victims. So let's talk about victim 3, not testifying, but how her inclusion in the indictment has impacted the trial. What are your thoughts on that? Has it impacted the trial? Not impacted the trial?
I think it could. I think that it can definitely impact the trial because her not speaking is still her speaking. And what I mean by that is her being too fearful, depending on how the jury looks at it. If she's too fearful to speak, I think that says volumes to the jury. Like, hey, this woman, even as with a pseudonym, even with the very likely promise of immunity, still is too scared to get in this courtroom in front of Sean Combs and tell her story. And I think that's a very powerful statement. Now, that's one way that it could be looked at. It playing devil's advocate here, it could be perceived, which I don't think it will. I think it's going to be perceived the way that I just said it. But it could be perceived as she doesn't want to do this because she doesn't believe that she was really a victim. And I really don't think that the jury, after everything that they've heard, is going to take it that way. I think it's going to be more she's too scared to testify. I think that obviously it hurts the prosecution a little bit. It helped the timeline of this trial be a little bit smaller, but I think that it hurts them in the way that what they would have gotten out of her would likely have been more powerful to the case than her just not showing up. Even though her not showing up, saying, I'm not going to do it, ultimately just not putting herself in that situation. While I think that does say a lot, I think that it could have been more if she'd been actually on the stand.
A counter argument can be that the prosecution believed that it wouldn't help the case, so they decided that she shouldn't testify. What are your thoughts on that? Does your viewers have any comments on that?
Well, I think that that's a good thought, a good counter argument. I don't think it's one that any of us have considered because the prosecution hasn't said, "Hey, we're going to scrap this witness for whatever." Now, it's obviously that's very possible that they haven't been forthcoming with the public for a myriad of different reasons, or even the jury in that case, and say, "Hey, she just didn't. We felt that she wasn't a valuable witness." And if that's the case, though, then I mean, obviously that's a good check for the defense.
So you have a lot of followers, which is absolutely amazing. What are the most interesting comments you've heard from your followers on social media?
Oh my God, that's hands down easily enough the conspiracies that are out there. The thing about social media that's very interesting is that, typically as social media creators, we get paid on views, right? So it doesn't matter if what you're saying in a story is true or not, because typically, especially in TikTok's very bad. Well, actually, all of them are very bad, but I'm not going to single out TikTok. But they're all very bad about it. They will not take down false information. They just let it ride. So when you have somebody coming out saying, "Have you heard this Prince audio where he said if something happens to me and I die, Diddy's responsible," and it was created with AI, and people are believing this, then you're like, no, no, that's not true. Or there are tunnels under Diddy's house that lead to the Playboy Mansion for trafficking. No, that's not true either. What about the baby oil that was laced with drugs? No, not true. And like, well, how do you know? And I'm like, or the thing with like, there's a bigger one, like, well, why aren't we talking about the minors, the kids that were at these freak offs? Because it's not true. They were all rumors and speculation. And what I've tried to explain to my followers, because the issue with this is that when you have somebody like me who tries their best to operate, I'm not going to say I'm always perfect. I'm human. I get things wrong and we have to make those corrections. But I try to operate solely on facts and things that we can prove that are confirmed, not conspiracy theories. But what I've told them is like, look, if you had baby oil laced with GHB, or you had a bunch of minors at these things, that would be what prosecution is leading with. 100,000%. They would bring in a bottle, show you the test of these bottles, show that it was laced and that it was being used in order to try to sedate these people. That would be what they're leading with 100%. But they're not, because there's just no truth to these rumors.
What is the most insightful comment you believe you received from your followers about the Diddy trial?
Oh, that's a great question. There's somebody had said something. It was actually yesterday. I don't remember what it was verbatim, or what it was, but it was just a very good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is what it is. The one of the most insightful was a very simple thing in trying to explain this. It's not what he did; it's how he did it. When it comes to Rico, it's not what he did; it's how he did it. And I thought that was an incredibly eloquent and insightful way of simplifying it and explaining this to people who struggle to understand Rico.
Is there anything else that you can think of that our viewers would want to know or should know about the Diddy trial?
You know, I'll respond to that with a question, which is, where is Christina Coram in all of this? For those who don't know, she was Diddy's chief of staff, right-hand person. She's not a witness that we know of. She's not charged with anything. She has been described as Diddy's version of Ghislaine Maxwell. So if Diddy was Jeffrey Epstein, she'd be the Ghislaine Maxwell. And she's not facing any type of charges, and she has been completely silent, disappeared this entire thing. And we can only speculate that either they're waiting to see what happens here to possibly bring charges against her, or another possibility that we don't know is that maybe she's behind the scenes, she's created an immunity deal, and she's helping to confirm and verify documents, certain text messages or things like that. But my question is, where is she and why aren't we hearing from her?
To the counter argument, if she is behind the scenes and allegedly getting immunity, then why wouldn't she testify? Why wouldn't the prosecution make that part of the deal?
That's a phenomenal question, and I agree with it. I don't have an answer for it. So that leads back to, where is she? Because she would probably have the most insight outside of somebody like Cassie, who was just with him for 10 years. She would have more insight than anybody else as to the inner workings, the payments, um, the patterns of abuse, the violence. She would know all of that because she was there to always pick up the pieces. So why is she not there? When she could be such a pivotal part of this case?
Well, there are lawsuits, civil lawsuits that include hers as well. Be interesting
Absolutely.
to see if she in fact has to testify in those cases or brought into those cases as well. Do you think that the criminal case will have any impact on these civil lawsuits?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes, and it regardless of verdict. So I think that, well, I said depending on verdict, I should say, on how it is. So I think that obviously if he is found guilty, then now it gives these civil lawsuits a tremendous amount of credibility, right? Because he's found guilty of all these things. A lot of these civil suits, mimic and mirror what we've heard from witnesses, from relationships. And, these were a lot of them, especially were filed prior to us hearing any of this. So I think that gives him a lot of credibility. At the same time, if he's found not guilty, then I think that some of them aren't going to hold water. But let's also remember that when you go back to like the OJ trial, while he was acquitted of murder, he was still found liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman in the civil section. So, the burden of proof is less there. But I think instead of maybe being dozens and dozens that get paid out, the 80 or however many we're at right now, that number might dwindle and people might either settle for less or they'll be dropped altogether. But that brings up a good point that I think your listeners will find interesting. And I learned this actually a couple days ago. Apparently in Montana, there is a call center that is handling specifically Diddy abuse claims. And this is the same company that handles the claims when you see them on TV or whatever on social media. Were you a victim of the Boy Scouts? Were you a victim of the, certain religious organizations? These massive organizations, that have, hundreds, if not thousands of victims that they're doing these civil lawsuits. Diddy has his own hotline for if you were a victim of Diddy, that you call and you hear that and they're using that to vet. And apparently they're getting 40 calls a week still while this is going on. So this could go so much bigger even after this trial with civil lawsuits alone.
Do your followers think he's guilty or innocent? What is their insight on this?
Well, they all think that he's absolutely guilty. And I agree that I'm going to put my answer as this. I think that he definitely deserves to be in jail. From the domestic violence standpoint, though, what we're looking at here is a trial that's got a specific set of charges. He's not on trial for being a jerk. He's not on trial for being violent for being a domestic abuser, domestically violent. So I think that even though he's definitely, in my mind, guilty of, racketeering, he's definitely guilty of trafficking, no doubt with, interstate travel to engage in prostitution. Is a jury going to see it that way? Yes, he's a jerk. Yes, he's done all this, but does he meet the requirements for a RICO conviction? And that's where I think that's going to be the biggest struggle in that. But I do think that the man is dangerous and he belongs in jail. He's made plenty of threats allegedly to people that they could disappear. If you just look at people who have been in his orbit over the last 30 years, there's a lot of people that are no longer alive, where he would have had things to gain. And I'm not saying that he's responsible for this. I'm just saying that, it's worth noting that there's a lot of people who have disappeared in his orbit. And, people have a reason that they're scared of him because those rumors are out there.
Swimming with the fishes, allegedly.
Yeah, in the East River. Nobody, no, that is straight, Italian mafia kind of threats. So take that for what it's worth.
Thanks for being here, Justin Shepard. He is the host of the Justin the Nick of Crime on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and on Substack at JustinTheNickofCrime.substack.com. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching Unresolved: The Diddy Cases. Stay tuned for more episodes.